word on this computer. Okay. All right. This is Cameron English, our Director of Biosciences, going to speak to us today about the role of government in speech as it pertains to science and health.
Straight to it, Tom. I like the introduction. No fluff. Well, thank you to you guys for joining us. As we were saying, just before we started recording, there isn't as much interest in this case, Murphy v. Missouri, that I hope there would be. There's some media coverage of it, but a lot of it is pretty superficial in terms of what it's saying about the argument. So I think this is a great opportunity for at least some of us to talk a little more about it. But I came to this topic. I've been following it loosely, but I had two colleagues at ACSH write a story where they essentially defended what the government did during the pandemic. And not to be disrespectful to my colleagues, because they're very thoughtful scholars and they've done great work over the years. But what the government did during COVID is censor speech it didn't like through the social media platforms. And there's no denying this. As you go through the discovery documents, as you go through information that was released publicly after Elon Musk bought Twitter, there's no denying that what the Biden administration did, what various executive agencies did, what nonprofit groups that were funded by the government did was go to Facebook or Twitter or whichever platform and say, you need to take this down. And if you don't take this down, there could be very severe consequences. So this is concerning, because in essence, what they did is they tried to end around the First Amendment. They didn't go to, a particular scientist or a particular person on Twitter and say, you take this down. They went to the intermediary, really, and again, this is the argument you will hear in response. In defense of what the government did, they'll say, well, it wasn't censorship because they didn't, it was the platforms that did it, right? So it's, we'll get into why I don't find that convincing, but I think that's really what's at stake here. And what this represents, and I'm sorry to sound dramatic, I can't help it, but the First Amendment is very seriously under threat here, depending on how this case goes, because in essence, what it's going to decide is how far the government can go in censoring speech it doesn't like. Now, it's always going to be in the name of protecting public health or protecting public safety or fighting terrorism. It's always going to be a noble cause. But as we'll see in this case, what it's actually used for is very, very different. So here's what we're going to do just to give us a roadmap. So I'm going to summarize the case as best I can. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to say that from the outset. So take that with a grain of salt, or take what I say today with a grain of salt. Everything's available publicly. So check the documents that I'm citing here. I did rely on legal scholarship wherever it was possible, including attorneys that are actually arguing the case. So I want to make that clear nonetheless, but we're going to summarize the case. I'm going to try to explain the government's argument in a little more detail. It's very complex, so we won't hit everything, but I'll try to explain it as best I can. I want to talk about the science community's response to what the government's saying. And then I want to go in as much detail as I can in the time we have and just explain why I find this utterly unconvincing and frankly disingenuous. So real brief, just a summary of the case. So the original lawsuit was filed in the spring of 2022. It was brought by the Missouri Attorney General and Louisiana and 5 private citizens. 3 of them are scientists. 2 of them are authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with that, but essentially it was a public expert challenge to the official public health response to COVID-19. So those 2 are Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford and Martin Kulldorff from Harvard. And then the other individuals, one of them is a scientist, but the other individuals are health freedom activists, is what they call themselves. I'm not here to defend the merits of what they say. That's really not what's at issue, but that's who's involved in the case. Now, they, through the process of discovery, they brought reams of evidence to bear on this question. And it's striking stuff. So let me give you just a couple of examples. If you haven't read my story, it's on our website right now. But in one instance, just for example, this is a White House communications staffer talking to Facebook. And he says, you guys are encouraging vaccine hesitancy by not taking this content down. In a direct quote, he says, this is a concern shared at the highest levels And I mean the highest levels of the White House. Wink, wink, right? So what is he saying there? He's like, the president himself is disappointed with you. On another occasion, we have a White House staffer saying, um, everyone here at meeting at the White House was internally considering our options about what to do in response to Facebook's either unwillingness or inability to take down every single post that the White House wanted them to do. Okay, now these are veiled threats, no doubt, right? You have a powerful federal executive saying, I want you to do something, and there's going to be consequences if you don't. So this would be akin to the mafia enforcer going up to a store owner and saying, gosh, you've got a great storefront here. I'd really hate for it to burn down. You know, there's bad guys in this neighborhood, but if you pay me, I'll keep those guys away, right? It's a protection racket in a sense. Now publicly, and this will be really important to the discussion, publicly, the Biden administration was saying these platforms are perpetuating misinformation, primarily about the vaccines is what they're concerned about in the context of COVID. They're saying these platforms are killing people by not taking this information down. The president is strongly in favor of reforming Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And right as of now, that law gives the platforms immunity for most of the content that's posted on their website. They can't be sued if RFK Jr. puts up a post and says, you know, COVID vaccines are deadly or whatever silly claim he's going to make. They can't be sued for that. They can moderate it, but they're not legally liable for it. So the administration publicly is saying we need to reform this law. It threatened antitrust litigation, which is important because that is a direct threat because the attorney general could bring a lawsuit like that or could start an investigation into these companies. So in other words, the point I'm making is that there were clear, if sometimes veiled threats to the platforms if they did not cooperate with the federal government in this case. So the Louisiana District Court, the Western District in Louisiana, heard this case and sided with the plaintiffs and issued a very broad injunction and said the platforms, or excuse me, the federal government and its various contractors and partners in the university and the nonprofit sectors, they may not interact with the platforms for the purpose of trying to alter their content moderation policies. So it was very, very broad, and it was designed intentionally. If you read the decision, the judge says we're cutting this off at the pass because this is not acceptable under the First Amendment. It's a very serious violation. So the government appealed to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit upheld the injunction, but narrowed it significantly just to the federal government because these other entities that we'll talk about in a little bit, like researchers at universities or nonprofit groups, they have their own free speech rights. So although we need to keep the federal government from silencing people on social media, these groups have first, or the individuals at these groups have First Amendment rights. So they narrowed the injunction. The government still wasn't satisfied, so they appealed to the Supreme Court. And then on March 18th, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments. And some of this was really interesting, but some of it was like technical legal stuff. They're talking about, you know, did the plaintiffs have standing to file this suit? What's the line between coercion and persuasion? Because typically, in most, from what I can tell, most legal scholars say persuasion is fine. The government can call up a newspaper editor, or they can reach out to Twitter, and they can say, "Hey, it's probably best if you take this down, because you know, for the public health or public safety, whatever." They can do that. They can interact, but they can't make threats of particularly criminal punishment. So that's the line. And so like when you may have seen the stories about Justice Jackson making those comments about the case during oral arguments, and there was this big hubbub on social media about her not understanding the First Amendment and being opposed to free speech. Those are the kind of issues, right? Where's the line between persuasion and coercion is essentially the key question, I think, as best I can tell. So the government's argument here is I want to be gentle. It's absurd. but it's not just that, it's disingenuous because in my understanding, it's clear that they recognized what they were doing, and what they're doing now is sort of a post hoc, you know, kind of a justification. So they said, we didn't compel the platforms to comply. We only tried to persuade them. We use the bully pulpit as a phrase you'll hear a lot, right? Like the president goes in public and he pounds his fist and he says, you better comply. That's typically recognized as acceptable because it's just the government or the president or whomever trying to persuade public opinion in a way that's going to get the result that they want. The other phrase you'll hear is jawboning. There's some disagreement, it seems, between legal scholars on this, and that just means you're using official speech to compel private action. Is just a very, very brief definition of that. But there seems to be disagreement among First Amendment experts about how legal that is or how justified it is. And again, that's essentially what the case seems to be about. But in any case, the government saying, we didn't force them, we just said, this would be a good thing for you to do. And if you go listen to the oral arguments or you read the transcript, you see like the Solicitor General says things like, like they were partners, the government and these platforms, and they had disagreements and, sometimes they didn't get along, but they were working together to protect people, But if you have in mind the examples that I just gave you, and there's many, many more in the district and circuit court decisions, hundreds of pages of evidence of the government just straight out threatening the platforms. And again, just one other example. This was a public example. This was, I believe it was Jen Psaki at the time, speaking for the White House. She suggested, and this was in May 2021, this was immediately after Facebook on one of the rare occasions had said, we're not going to take this post down. It doesn't violate our terms of service. So within a week, so that was on May 1st. On May 5th, Jen Psaki comes out publicly and says, the platforms need to do more to ensure that this type of misinformation and disinformation is not going out to the public. And if they don't, there's going to be a robust antitrust program. So, I mean, the lawyers will argue about, what exactly what sort of language is that? Are they trying to compel it? Or is it coercive? Is it persuasion, whatever? I mean, but in just normal English, what is that, right? That is, do what I want, or I'm going to hit you in the knee with a baseball bat. And that's in the plaintiff's response to the Supreme Court after the government appealed it, if you want to look that up. But anyways, it seems to me that the argument is disingenuous on those grounds. And now they're also saying, and this is in the oral arguments too, the Solicitor General or the Deputy Solicitor General said something to the effect of, we were really concerned at the time because there were a lot of people dying from COVID still. And we thought that getting more people vaccinated would put an end to the pandemic. And so this was our motivation, right? We're trying to protect the public health. They come back to this constantly, but that was their basic idea is we're not forcing anyone, we're trying to persuade them, and we had legitimate grounds for doing that. Now, the science community's response, and as I said at the top, this is what motivated my article in the first place, is that you basically have a lot of people in science or they're science adjacent, they're policy scholars or, they pay attention to legal issues related to science and public health. As best I can tell, they seem to be saying, this is good. This is good. We need experts at the CDC and the FDA and NIAID and the White House. We need them monitoring social media because there's deadly misinformation everywhere. There's disinformation, there's malinformation, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in essence, they seem to see a society where we have tinkerers managing what everyone thinks and says as a good thing, as long as they're the ones doing it. That seems to be the incentive. And again, we'll talk later about why that's a threat to science. So that was what was disturbing to me. But you'll see things from people in academia. They'll say like, well, the government just sent emails. Are emails really that threatening? Are you so right? You crazy First Amendment radicals, are emails so scary? And the obvious response is it's not that they sent the email. It's not the medium. It's the content of the email, right? So for example, hypothetically, if my wife sent me an email and said, I wanted to, would you say, well, it's just an email, Cameron, get over it, right? It's the language, right? It's the message that you're communicating. So again, I think most people that are making that argument, they're to scrutiny. So let's try to rebut some of these claims.
Faded out there a couple of times, Cameron.
I'm sorry?
You faded out a couple of times.
Okay, what's the last thing you guys heard? I didn't mean to leave you hanging.
Um, it was right after you talked about your wife sending you an email, the hypothetical.
Okay, so just to be clear, so if my wife sends me an email and she says, I want a divorce, our marriage is over, it's like you wouldn't say to me, well, it's just an email, Cameron, get over it. It's not that big of a deal, right? It's the content of the email. It's not the medium of the communication. So if the government emails you and
Doing it again.
Let's do again.
It did it again, Cameron. Try now.
hello,
There you go.
hello.
Hear you now.
Okay, I apologize. I'm not sure what's going on. We'll do the best we can. Anyways, the only point I'm making is that, the medium of the communication isn't the key issue. It's what's being said. And what's clear from the court documents is that the government was threatening punishment. But let me go through a couple other things here. So, when I read a transcript of the oral arguments and you hear the government say, we weren't making a credible threat because we are the executive branch. We don't pass laws. So we can't change Section 230. That's not up to us. That's up to Congress. So we weren't making a credible threat. As I said earlier, we were just using the bully pulpit to try to convince the platforms to cooperate. Now, the first question that came to my non-lawyer mind was, well, why would you make a threat that you knew you couldn't carry out? And the obvious answer, and this comes from Ilya Soman. He's a law professor at George Mason. And I want to be clear, he seems to think that there was coercion involved here, but he's not as sold on it as I am. But nevertheless, he points out here, and this is a direct quote, he says, importantly, the people making these statements, meaning the officials at the White House talking to the social media platforms, the officials making these statements had superiors who had the power to carry out at least some of these veiled threats. So in other words, when they're making these threats to Facebook and Twitter, they're not messing around. They're not bluffing. They're doing it because they know that their bosses could act on the threats they were making. Now, more interestingly, and this is an argument the plaintiffs are making in court, and it seems to me historically and legally they have good support for this. They're pointing out that even if the government technically didn't violate the coercion standard, and it seems to me the government is arguing we didn't literally force them. They could have said no to us, and on occasion they actually did say no to us. That's one of their rebuttals in court. So we didn't coerce them. They could have done otherwise. And the plaintiffs are saying, well, even if you didn't on that standard coerce them, you still violated the First Amendment because the First Amendment's language is very specific. It says you can't pass a law abridging the freedom of speech, and abridging just means you can't do anything. You can't have any policy that attempts to limit legal speech. So this is very, very important. So even if the government proves that we didn't coerce anybody, the plaintiffs are saying, well, you still tried to manipulate them into doing what you want, and that is clearly outside of the bounds of the First Amendment. And they also point out that the First Amendment applies to Congress. So the law is saying Congress can't do this, and the implication within that is that the executive has no authority here whatsoever. So interestingly, what they're doing is they're sort of flipping the government's argument on its head, and they're saying, that's right, you are the executive, you are not the lawmaking branch of the government, you're not Congress. So in fact, not only are you not allowed to pass a law, you're not allowed to make any policy in this regard, because as the First Amendment says, that's what Congress does. I was telling Tom before we started here, I'm so much disappointed in the analysis of this case because a lot of it centers around court precedent. People are less interested today in what the text of the amendment actually says. What did the writers think they were writing down? What were their intentions? That's just not as important today in modern society. I find that unfortunate. But nevertheless, if you want to look at court precedent, the Supreme Court has ruled multiple times, and here I'm quoting from a case, it's Cummings versus Missouri, if you want to look up the case. But the direct quote here is, the government cannot, what cannot be done directly cannot be done indirectly. So in other words, the Supreme Court has ruled on one of the key issues in this case multiple times, namely, if the government's not allowed to directly censor information, it can't coerce or whatever, push, whatever, it can't get a third party to do that. And that, it seems to me, is exactly what they did in this instance. And so one way you can think about this, and I got this analogy from Eugene Volokh. He is a professor of law at UCLA. He runs the Volokh Conspiracy blog at Reason Magazine. Really interesting stuff if you like these topics. But so he pointed out that the government cannot open up, say, a public library to community meetings and then say these meetings are prohibited. If you have these political views or if you're joining to discuss this cause, you may not do that. They can't do that. Everyone agrees on that. So, under a precedent like this, they couldn't then go to a private institution, so like a private school library, and say, you have to kick these people out of your library because we don't like what they're saying. Everybody would rightly recognize that that is illegal too. And so this is the argument that they're making to the Supreme Court, the plaintiffs, I mean. So they're saying you're basically trying to do exactly what the amendment and this precedent says you're not allowed to do. Okay, so we're mostly done with the legal stuff. I'm sorry. I think it's important to cover, but I find it sort of obnoxious because the lawyers argue over, the discrete meaning of words and, what is persuasion? Like everybody knows what persuasion is. Do we really have to spend hours, dissecting the meaning and the etymology of this word? Whatever. So, the idea that the government should be the arbiter of facts and falsehood on social media, I just don't find compelling at all. And the reason for that, of course, is that they got lots wrong during the pandemic. And in fact, they got things wrong when scientists were telling them, don't do this. This is wrong. There's no evidence for this policy. So just two brief examples here. So as early as the spring of 2020, Dr. Tony Fauci was telling the public these lockdowns are necessary because they're saving millions of lives. So even if there are consequences, economic consequences, et cetera, they're worth the trade-off. Now, there were lots of scientists opposing that at the time, including my predecessor, Dr. Alex Berezow, who is a microbiologist. So he has some insight into this topic. He pointed out in one of the articles he wrote that there was no evidence for the lockdown policies. This was being done, sort of on speculation or out of fear, out of a sort of a precautionary reaction to this novel virus. And he was saying there are going to be very severe consequences here. Now that perspective was largely ignored through most of 2020. I mean, now today it's recognized pretty widely that the lockdowns were a mistake. There was that big Atlantic piece where they were calling for pandemic amnesty, essentially, yeah, we got some things wrong, but hey, nobody's perfect, so let's call it a day, right? That you got that kind of stuff. You have the New York Times saying a few weeks ago that maybe it was a mistake to treat people like they were robots that were to be ordered around to avoid viral infection. They called that a liberal policy, so it's very much in the mainstream today to say the lockdowns were a mistake. But there were people saying it at the time, the government ignored them. Moving on, just one other example, because I don't want to belabor it. In 2021 and 2022, the Biden administration pushed boosters for everybody over 12, and then later on for children as young as 6 months. Now, this information comes from Dr. Paul Offit's book. It's called Tell Me When It's Over. It's sort of his analysis of the pandemic. Came out just in February. It's really good reading if you have questions about this. But he points out, for example, in 2022, the FDA Vaccine Advisory Council voted on whether or not the bivalent boosters were necessary for everybody, including children. And Offit points out that, there were studies done that showed that the bivalent boosters were no better than the primary doses that people were receiving in terms of protecting them from severe infection and death, severe disease and death. Now, the Biden administration and the FDA, just assuming that these studies were going to turn out in their favor, they just started producing millions of doses of the bivalent boosters, just assuming that they were going to be validated. And I believe as well, they were also relying on studies from Israel and a few other places where it was primarily elderly people being boosted. And of course, those people are at severe risk, much higher risk of severe disease or even death. So a bivalent booster probably makes sense for that age cohort, but it doesn't make sense for everyone, right? A 6-month-old does not have anywhere near the same amount of risk from COVID as someone who's 75 or 80 years old. And again, my only point here is that you have eminent experts, even like Dr. Paul Offit, who's very much in the mainstream. He's not fringe in any way. You have people like him saying this booster policy doesn't make any sense. It's not supported by the evidence. And I interviewed him just last week for our podcast, which you can go listen to. And he said, sort of jokingly, he's like, I don't have any friends left in public health because of this, because he was willing to say to his colleague on the FDA advisory panel and other people in public health. And he says he called these people. He says, I called them and I said, stop saying this because it's not true. And, the reaction was, we don't like you anymore. So, and he outlined his argument for this in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's a really interesting commentary. You can read that. I think it's open access. So, nevertheless, point I'm making is the government is setting itself on a perch and saying, we get to dictate what's truth and false, or, truth and falsity or whatever. We get to determine that on social media because we're smart and we're your betters, we're your overlords. So just trust us. Obviously, that's not the case. And these are just two examples. I've got a million more that are probably more absurd, where the government just says things that are patently false. So I don't think they have the credibility to take that spot. So a couple other things. The government also, and you can read these in the documents. If you read the Twitter files, especially, there's a lot of information related to this. The government knowingly censored factual information. And its justification for this was essentially the average person on Twitter is not smart enough to understand what they're reading, and we're fearful it's going to promote vaccine hesitancy. And this is not like obscure blog posts. It's not a rant from Alex Jones, or it's not crazy stuff. It's like New York Times reporting where they're talking about rare but real side effects with the vaccine. So with Johnson & Johnson, it was very rare blood clots. It primarily affected women that were 35 to 40, I believe. And then myocarditis with the mRNA vaccines. Again, these are rare side effects. In most cases, they're not severe. The disease itself, COVID-19, causes both of these at much higher rates. But nevertheless, the government didn't trust people to interpret that information accurately. So you had some of the nonprofit groups, the state-funded nonprofit groups involved here, like the Virality Project at Stanford University, was reaching out to Facebook, and it was reaching out to these platforms and saying, this is malinformation, right? It can be misinterpreted. We recommend that you take this down. And again, that's a recommendation coming from a state-funded NGO. And as we've seen, the Biden administration was not shy about the threats it was making. So the point then, and this is one of the important implications, is that the censorship never stops where they say it stops, right? So when all of the apologists for the Biden administration go publicly, they say, we're doing this for your good. We're protecting you from misinformation. There's disinformation. There's people trying to sell supplements to you, and they're lying, and they're greedy, and they want money. But none of them will deal with this. None of them will say, oh, yeah, well, we also want to take down truthful information because we thought you were too stupid to understand it, And I find that frankly insulting as a parent, as a voter, as a taxpayer. It's like I'm smart enough to live my life and to pay for all of this as a taxpayer, but I'm too dumb to understand the implications of it, So it's like, as a taxpayer, I can pay for the development of this vaccine through Operation Warp Speed. But if I want to look at the results and figure out whether or not it's worth taking or not, no, you can't do that. You're not smart enough, But anyways, it's a classic argument. It's censorship begets more censorship. It never stops where they say it does, and they don't want to explain that to you. The other thing is that this is a serious threat to science, and it's very easy to see this. So if you think about the peer review process, that is premised on the fact that you can do an experiment the way you think is the best way to do it, and then submit your results to your colleagues who can critique your work. If the government can come in and say, the question you're asking is off limits, or the study design that you're doing is off limits, because we say so, not because it's unethical or not because there's a problem with it, but because we've just determined that you're not allowed to answer that question. You don't meaningfully have science at that point. You just have, court apologists. You just have court academics who are going to say the regime approved thing. And there's no point, right? Science doesn't function. The other issue is that, and this is closely related, but if the government can do this, then they're not accountable in fundamental ways, So you saw this a lot with mask mandates and vaccine mandates. The argument was it's not that big of an imposition. Just put on the stupid mask and then you can go to the store. Stop being so selfish. That you want a haircut, put on a mask. But all of this kind of rhetoric was very common. But what this overlooked is that the government was often making policy without good evidence behind it. Now, later on, they would try to fund research or they would do a meta-analysis that would seem to justify the policy, but the policy often came first. And that's what people were objecting to. So it's not necessarily that masks are useless in every situation. They're not, right? The common example is in a surgical setting or in a healthcare setting more broadly. Putting on a mask probably has some benefit. But this was not explained to people, right? The explanation was follow the science, right? All the fact checkers know, and we talked to the CDC. We all know what's your problem, right? But if you went and looked at the research, a lot of it was low quality. It wasn't very good. And people were just told, shut your face. That's not the question you're allowed to ask. Put on a mask.
Well, before that, remember the government was saying don't wear masks. They don't help.
Yes. Right. And that's an interesting example because they later came out and said, we were wrong about that, right? Right. Because originally they said you don't need to wear a mask. And then they came back later and they said, okay, well, it's good to wear them, but we didn't have enough. And so instead of just telling you we didn't have enough, we told you didn't need them, right? So even in trying to correct their mistake, they were making another one. It's like from the get-go, there was deep distrust seated in federal institutions. But all of this goes to the point I'm making, which is that if they don't have to explain to you what they're doing, they get to do whatever they want. And it's not going to happen overnight, but we've seen examples throughout history, and everyone's favorite is Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union. That's the most extreme example where you have some crazy guy that doesn't believe in genetics that controls the agricultural policy of an entire nation. That's as insane as it can get. We're obviously not there yet, but we are on the way to a situation where science is what the government says it is. They get to carry out whatever policy they want. And if you don't like it, that's too damn bad in essence. So let me end here. This is a quote from Paul Offit's book, which is, as I said, is Tell Me When It's Over. And he says here, speaking of trust in science, specifically as it relates to vaccines, he says, I think we should always be able to question the science behind public health recommendations. And this questioning should occur in the open so that the public and the press can best understand the strengths and weaknesses behind specific recommendations. Every recommendation has strengths and weaknesses. If we fear public debate, then anti-vaccine activists really have won. So again, that would be compelling if it were from Vivek Ramaswamy or Ron DeSantis or some typical right-wing pundit. It's still a very good point, but in this case, it's coming from one of the preeminent authorities on vaccine safety and science communication. Paul Offit's been at this for a long time. So that's a critical point. If you want the public's trust, just explain to them what you're doing. They don't expect you to have all the answers, but they do want to know what you're up to. And if you make a mistake, tell them you make a mistake. I mean, this is common sense. Everyone who's ever been in a relationship knows that you're not going to be perfect, but you have to be truthful when you do things wrong. And that's the critical point here. So I'll stop talking. And then if you have questions or comments, I'd be happy to chat.
Anybody have any questions? You don't, Nigel?
So what do you do about misinformation, about vaccine deniers or Kennedy and so on? What do you do about them?
You correct them publicly. So the administration, if they wanted to, they could have come out and made a public statement, and they could have said, there was a lot of talk, for example, about the disinformation dozen, of which Kennedy was one. So there were this handful of people that were perpetuating most of the myths on social media. You could have called them out publicly. You could have, contacted the press. You could have said, this is what we're talking about. This is a very serious threat. You could have engaged a lot of the same experts to correct that nonsense or misinformation or whatever you want to call it. You can call things out publicly. And the interesting thing about that is that there's a lot of research that shows when you engage with someone like him publicly, and there's an audience that's genuinely curious, that's very effective in terms of diffusing their concerns about the vaccine, because they're watching an exchange and they're being allowed to go, oh, that's why the vaccine, strictly speaking, didn't stop mild infections from occurring because of the incubation period. Like little things like that, you can explain simple facts that people grasp, and that's much more effective. And one of the reasons too is that you're not violating their trust. You're not just telling them. And again, by the way, we only know this was happening because of these lawsuits and because of the Twitter files, right? So if you do things in the open, you can change people's minds. I think that's the best approach to this.
But then the question becomes, why didn't they try to silence him when he was opposed to MMR? I mean, those are vaccines that have been around for decades, and have proven to be very effective. We have measles outbreaks now because people have become vaccine hesitant for those kind of successful vaccines. So the question becomes, if the government has this obligation to censor speech, if its purpose is to promote public health, then why wasn't the government doing its job 15, 20 years ago when all this garbage about that the MMR vaccine was?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer. I think part of it is that, of course, there wasn't a pandemic going on, and I think anytime you have like a real critical health emergency like we had, you have public institutions that they're not only trying to do what they think is best, but they're trying to cover their asses, essentially. They're trying to do things that like when people look back on what they did, they can say, we did the best we could. Now, they made a lot of mistakes along the way for some of the reasons we've discussed. But I think, 20 years ago when Kennedy was going on about MMR and autism, there wasn't a massive outbreak of measles. There were smaller pockets of outbreaks, and there have been more since. But I just don't think there was the same amount of urgency because it wasn't a pandemic. And then, interestingly, and Offit has talked about this as well, so has David Ropick. He was at Harvard, but he's a risk communication expert. One of the points that they've made is that throughout the 80s and the 90s, the media, like CNN, NPR, all of these places, they gave a platform to the anti-vaccine message, and they framed it as like an equal debate. We've got this doctor who says this shot might cause autism, and I've got a study in the Lancet that demonstrates it. And then you have all of these other experts saying, no, that's not true, right? But they facilitated the debate. They gave people like Kennedy and his associates a lot of airtime, and they entered the mainstream consciousness because of the media coverage. So that's another thing that's related to this that doesn't get nearly as much attention, is that a lot of the people now who I can't stand, all of these fact-checking organizations and all of the, the Washington Post, all of the news outlets, they have a fact-checking station or brigade or whatever you want to call it. And yet, even during the pandemic, they were running misleading stories about breakthrough infections, which were wrong. And they were giving, like the Washington Post gave a platform to Stephanie Seneff, who is an MIT computer scientist, but she believes the nuttiest things about pesticides. She thinks they cause terrorist attacks. And at one point, she said that there's a weed killer that may have contributed to COVID-19, which is like the dumbest thing with no possible mechanism. It makes no scientific sense. But the Washington Post gave her a platform to talk about pesticides in 2021. It was either 2020 or 2021. So while they're warning the world about how you have to follow the science and you have to trust your betters at the CDC, they're giving this crazy person a platform. And everyone was fine with that. The government didn't come out and say, hey, Washington Post, that's disinformation. How dare you, right? It was only people who were challenging government policy as it related to COVID who were being kicked off social media. So that's a very long-winded answer, Nigel. I'm sorry. I hope that clarifies.
So if these legal shenanigans come out the way you're hoping, is that going to fix the problem?
Oh, I don't know. That's a thing, right? I'm not gonna make a prediction. I think ideally what would happen is the Supreme Court would look at this, especially the textual argument that the plaintiffs are making, and they would say, oh yeah, well, clearly they're violating the First Amendment because you're not allowed to abridge free speech. So ideally, they would look at that and they'd go, yeah, this injunction stands and none of this is allowed anymore. Have a nice life, everybody. But I don't think that's going to happen. From the analysis I'm reading, it seems like they're more inclined to side with the Biden administration. They probably won't go full tilt if I had to guess, but again, don't put any stock in that. Don't buy shares of anything based on what I tell you. But it seems to me they're not going to come out in complete support of the First Amendment in this case. But again, I don't know. So
even if they do, it seems to me the government would find ways to twist arms.
Well,
I don't
yeah.
know.
Oh, go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
it's especially if the entity that they're using or twisting the arms up actually agrees with the government anyway.
Mhm.
So it really reinforces that long-held conservative belief that government and media are in lockstep.
Mhm. Well, that's a more important point, I think, is that the culture of the country is changing significantly. You know, if you look at, because I guess I'm an older millennial or whatever, but if you look at people younger than me, and Gen Z and Gen Y or whatever they're called, they just don't have as much of an appreciation for free speech or for a lot of civil liberties. Or, you know, like if you ask a 20-year-old what natural law is, they're just going to look at you cross-eyed because they haven't even heard the term. You know, like the idea that you have fundamental rights that don't come from government, but they're fundamental to human nature. That, you know, that concept is just increasingly foreign to people. So I think that's probably the broader problem that Tom's getting
Because
at.
you don't have
is,
free speech on college campuses now.
right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people.
If one student or one professor does not like what that person is going to talk about, they can bar that person from talking on the campus.
Mhm.
So that's their rule for what free speech is. I have the freedom to not be required to let this guy have a platform at a place where I currently am.
Mhm.
So it's
Yep.
a dangerous situation, and that generation just does not understand any of this. You're absolutely right. It's failure of America's education system.
Yeah, I sound like a crotchety old man every day. The older I get, the grumpier I get. It's
Sitting on my
inevitable.
front porch in a rocking chair.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody have anything else?
Now, it's been interesting. Thanks for this.
Yeah, my
Okay,
pleasure.
can I just broaden it? And I don't know enough details and so on. But it does seem that, for example, X, that used to be Twitter, is saying all kinds of things which are not true and sometimes nasty and whatever, racist, and has enormous following. Should we just let it happen? Is there something, what can be done about, what should be done, if anything, about that, where it has such influence, but also it's mainly coming from somebody who has some funny views of the world and society.
Yeah, I think it would depend on the context, you know. So if it's, you know, if it's a crazy person saying something that's blatantly racist, then, you know, I may not like that. But if it's not attached to a threat, if they're not saying, you know, go do whatever, you know, go commit a violent crime, that of course can be prevented. You know, I don't think anyone would object to that. And I think there's legal justification for silencing that kind of speech if you're threatening violence. But, you know, I don't know, even if something is wrong, that you want the government stepping in, because it's one of those situations where the cure is often worse than the disease. And when you talk about the government being the arbiter, I mean, and some of my colleagues don't like when I talk about this, but the CDC today, with a straight face, will tell you that men can breastfeed. Like it's just a scientific fact that everybody knows, right? It wasn't a thing until 10 years ago, but the CDC's website says that now. And you can find
it shows how to properly do it.
Yeah. The American Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine calls it father's milk. You know, and you have major scientific institutions denying that biological sex is binary. I mean, it's a fundamental fact of biology. I don't even think you can make sense of evolution without it. And yet, Nature, Science, Scientific American, the White House coming out in support of gender affirming care, which means giving minors powerful drugs that have not been tested for that purpose. You know, so it's like you have major institutions and the experts that they rely on saying the dumbest, frankly, sometimes evil things, you know? So I guess that's a long way of saying there's always a trade-off. There's always a risk and there's always a benefit. And I just don't think giving people like that the authority to regulate what everyone says and thinks online is a good idea.
And don't forget, well, when the pandemic first hit, the CDC was spending millions of dollars on research for things like how long does the virus live on metal? How long does it live on plastic? How long does it live on wood? It doesn't matter. It's an airborne virus. You're not going to catch it from a tabletop. You're not going to catch it from a cloth. So that was wasted dollars. But they're making sure the media knows about all these things. One study said that it lasted for like 2 days on plastic, no, 2 days on wood, but like 3 days on plastic. And it's like, why are you giving me a news report on something that's totally irrelevant? But the government was pushing this stuff out because they were funding it.
Did we know it was irrelevant at that time? I mean, we soon did, but
we know it was aerial. I mean, it's a coronavirus. It's an airborne disease. We know it affects the lungs. We knew all of that.
We know that now, but
we knew it back. We knew it back as soon as it was talked about in January of 2020. We knew what it was. That's why that was called the coronavirus.
You know what might be more interesting though is that it took the World Health Organization, I want to say close to 2 years, to correct that observation, because they came out and they said it's not airborne. You know, people can sneeze it on you, but it doesn't hang around in the air. And the CDC came out pretty quickly. You know, I don't remember the exact date, but they came out relatively quickly and said it is airborne. But it took WHO close to 2 years to update that guidance. So, you know, I don't think that's nefarious, but I think it's an example of what happens when, you know, you have endorsed experts who are allowed to dictate things like that.
Anything else?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cameron.
Thanks everybody for participating.
Yeah, and thank you for the spirited questions. Nigel's always the one, it seems, who comes back and hits me with the challenge, and it keeps me sharp. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're well up to the challenge, Cameron.
But I really appreciate it. It's a great example of what I'm talking about, which is, you know, two ideas. Let's see, you know, which one can withstand scrutiny. So thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Yeah, thank you both.